They told JDVance to leave, expecting him to get angry. His response left the whole diner in silence. JDVance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a modest spot in the middle of Springfield, Ohio, the kind of place that had been around for decades. Its neon sign flickered slightly, buzzing in the evening air. Through the door, the scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee drifted out, slipping through the cracks every time someone walked in or out. He had heard about it from a local earlier that day, someone who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. Now, after a long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions, all JD wanted was a quiet meal before the drive back. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The place was small but welcoming. At least, that's how it felt at first. The kind of diner where the same handful of regulars occupied the same booths every night, where a wall of faded Polaroids by the register showcased decades of customers and staff. The air was thick with the scent of bacon grease and brewed coffee, the low hum of conversation filling the room. JD caught the eye of the hostess behind the counter. She was mid-smile until she recognized him. It was quick, barely a second, but he noticed it. A hesitation, the kind that flickered across a person's face when they weren't sure what to do. Her lips pressed into a thin line. JD glanced around. A few customers had turned their heads. One man, halfway through his burger, leaned in and whispered something to the person across from him. A woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down a little too hard, her eyes narrowing before she looked away. JD wasn't naive. He'd been in enough rooms to sense when he wasn't welcome. But here, the hostess hesitated before stepping forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Good evening," she said carefully. "Are you dining in or taking out?" JD let out a small, tired chuckle. "Dining in, if that's all right." Another pause. Too long for such a simple question. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I need to check something real quick. Just one moment." Then she disappeared through the swinging doors. JD was left standing there. A few more heads turned his way. A man at the counter shifted in his seat. Someone muttered something under their breath. Something wasn't right. From behind the kitchen doors, muffled voices rose and fell, too indistinct to make out. JD exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He wasn't going to make a scene. He wasn't going to assume anything either. Maybe there was a policy. Maybe they were short-staffed. Maybe. The hostess returned. This time, she didn't look uncertain. She looked decided. "Sorry, sir," she said, her voice firmer now. "We can't serve you tonight. No explanation. No, we're closing soon. Just that." For a brief moment, JDVance said nothing. The words just sat there between them, thick and heavy like a statement that didn't need an explanation. The diner had gone quiet. Not silent, but quiet enough. The sizzle of the grill in the back still crackled. A fork scraped against a plate somewhere, but the usual hum of conversation had dulled. People were watching, waiting. JD studied the hostess's face. She wasn't hostile, just firm. Like she'd made up her mind, or maybe someone else had made it up for her. His eyes flicked toward the kitchen window. A pair of cooks stood just beyond the counter, half hidden behind a heat lamp stacked with plates. Their expressions, unreadable. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong?" The hostess didn't fidget this time. "It's just..." She started, then stopped, then finally, "We'd rather not serve you tonight." No policy, no excuse, just that. JD let his hands settle on his hips. Exhaled through his nose. He'd been in his fair share of uncomfortable situations, from heated political debates to interviews designed to trip him up. But this was different. There was something about being turned away from a place as simple as a roadside diner. That hit differently. And then, a cough broke the moment. Someone at the counter shifted in their seat. The tension in the room was thick, enough to cut with a knife. And JDVance? He had a choice to make. Would he walk away? Would he argue? Would he get angry, just like they expected him to? Or would his response be something else entirely? What happened next left the whole diner in silence. JDVance was told to leave. His response left the whole diner in silence. GD. Vance turned slightly, catching the gaze of an older man sitting near the counter. The guy looked like he'd been coming here for years. His blue work jacket was frayed at the cuffs, his hands weathered from a lifetime of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing at the last of his eggs. A few booths over, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed like he was enjoying the show. JD took it all in. The eyes that looked away the second they met his, the ones that lingered too long, the ones that held something sharper, something closer to satisfaction. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had options. He could walk out, shake his head, let it go. He could demand an explanation, call them out, ask if they had any idea what this would look like in the morning news cycle. He could challenge them outright, see if they'd stick to their decision when they realized they were refusing a U.S. senator. Instead, he did none of those things. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. His voice was even, measured. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated again, glancing toward the kitchen as if asking for silent permission. At the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered something under his breath. Someone near the window let out a short laugh, like they couldn't believe he was actually going through with this. JD just stood there, waiting. The hostess disappeared through a different door. A few more beats of silence. A sip of coffee. A plate slid across the counter. Then, the door swung, open. A man in his early 50s stepped out, broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. His name tag read, Don. Don didn't ask JD what he wanted. He just looked him over once and said, "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. JDVance met Don's stare, steady, unreadable. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to throw his weight around, but he also wasn't about to walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," JD said. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply through his nose, like he'd been expecting the question but still wasn't in the mood to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing at the customers still watching, the exchange. Some pretended not to listen, others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. Finally, Don shifted his weight and said, "Look, this ain't personal." JD raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for. I got a business to run, and I don't want trouble." JD nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter where the old man in the work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing a little slower now. A few booths away, the younger guy still had his arms crossed, watching like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. JD had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. It wasn't about a single decision. It was about what it meant, how it would look, how people would react. It was about the ripple effect. The pressure. From all sides, JDVance was told to leave. His response left the whole diner in silence. The silent expectations in the room were heavy, the kind that could push a person into choices they weren't even sure about. JD glanced back at Don. "Be honest with me," he said, voice steady. "Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers curled slightly against his apron, and for the first time, JD saw something close to discomfort. Like maybe Don wasn't as sure about this as he wanted to seem. But before Don could answer, the younger guy in the booth let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on," the guy scoffed, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." JD turned toward him, studying him for a moment. He looked like the kind of guy who enjoyed a good fight, someone who'd been waiting for an excuse to say something. But JD didn't bite. He just looked back at Don. "I've got no problem leaving," JD said, "if that's really what you want." The words hung there, giving Don a chance to take a breath, a chance to reconsider, a chance to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. Don's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to JD. "I just don't want things to get ugly." JD nodded. "Neither do I." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. JD could have left. He could have shaken his head, walked out, never looked back. He could have made a call, turned this into a headline, let the internet do what it does best. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Then let's talk." The room tensed. JD didn't slam the chair down. He didn't puff up his chest or raise his voice. He simply sat, resting his hands on the table, like he had all the time in the world. The diner wasn't used to this. Confrontations usually ended quickly, with one side storming out or shutting down. But this wasn't that. Don looked at him for a long moment, then let out a slow exhale. "Talk," he repeated, like the word itself didn't belong here. JD shrugged. "You don't want me here. I get that. What I don't get is why. So, let's talk about it." A low chuckle came from the younger guy in the booth. "Man, this guy's got nerve." JD ignored him. Don pulled out the chair across from JD, but he didn't sit. Instead, he leaned on it, arms resting against the back. His apron was still dusted with flour from the morning shift. "I run a business," Don said finally. "I don't pick fights. I don't want headlines, but I got a community to think about." JD nodded. "All right, so tell me, what does this community think about me?" Don looked over his shoulder, almost like he was waiting for someone else to answer that question. The waitress by the counter shifted uncomfortably. The man in the work jacket kept his eyes down, his fork motionless on his plate. Then Don looked back. "People here don't like politicians, don't trust them. And some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for, it doesn't sit right with folks." JD leaned back slightly. "Fair enough. But you don't know me, do you?" Don hesitated. "Not personally, no." "Then tell me," JD continued. "If I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation?" Silence. JD let it stretch, watching Don's expression shift. Not a full change, but something. Cracked, just slightly. Then, from the back of the room, the younger guy scoffed. "This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are." JD turned toward him. "And who am I?" The guy grinned, finally getting the attention he'd been craving. "You're the guy who acts like he understands regular people, but you play politics like everyone else." JD nodded slowly, considering that. "All right, then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The guy blinked. That wasn't the response he was expecting. "You want me gone? Fine. But you've got the floor. Say, what do you need to say?" The diner was dead silent now. Even the kitchen had gone still. No plates clinking, no orders being called out. Don sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This ain't what I expected tonight." JD cracked a small, tired smile. "Me neither." But for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division, it was about something else. something closer to understanding. The diner wasn't just quiet now. It was watching. Even those who had pretended not to care were listening, sneaking glances over their plates. JD sat there, patient. The younger guy, still leaning back in his booth, looked like he wanted to say something. But for the first time, hesitation crossed his face. Maybe because he realized JD wasn't arguing. He wasn't defending himself. He was just listening. And that was something no one had expected. JDVance sat down. What happened next? No one expected. He was just waiting. Don, still gripping the chair in front of him, finally let out a breath. "You want to know what people think?" He shook his head. "They think you're full of it." JD didn't react, just tilted his head slightly like he was considering the words. "They think you talk about working-class folks, but you still play the game. That you make promises like every other guy in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing changes." Don exhaled sharply through his nose. "And they don't forget." JD nodded slowly. "I get that." The younger guy in the booth scoffed. "That's all you're gonna say?" JD turned toward him. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened in his seat. "I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue. Defend yourself. Say something." JD rested his forearms on the table. "You already made up your mind about me before I walked through that door. You wanted me to get mad. Wanted me to fight back so you could feel justified." The guy's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. JD continued, his voice steady. "But what if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like?" He looked back at Don. "You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt left behind. And yeah, I went to school. Did things people never expected me to do. But that doesn't mean I forgot." Don's fingers tapped against the chair, his expression unreadable. But he didn't look dismissive. He looked thoughtful. JD glanced around the diner. "You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. But I walked in here as a customer, not a politician, just a guy looking for a meal." A pause. Then, from the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered, "Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger." The tension cracked, just slightly. A few people smirked. Even Don let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. JD turned back to him. "So, what now?" Don exhaled, running a hand over his face. He looked toward the kitchen where the cooks were still watching, then back at JD. "I'll tell you what," Don finally said. "You sit here and finish this conversation. And if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking. A good game, maybe, just maybe. I'll have my waitress bring you a menu." JD nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sounds like a deal." For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else, something closer to a conversation. The air in the diner had changed. The stiffness in Don's shoulders had eased, just a little. The younger guy in the booth had lost his smirk, now sitting up instead of leaning back like this was some kind of show. Even the customers who had stayed quiet, watching from the sidelines, seemed less certain of their own judgments. JD leaned forward slightly. "All right," he said, voice calm. "Let's finish this conversation." Don exhaled, dropping into the chair across from him. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long shift, but the kind that settles deep in a person. The weight of years of expectations. Of feeling like the world isn't listening. "What? Be honest," Don said, rubbing his hands together. "I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you're really looking out for folks like us, or if you just know how to talk a good game." JD nodded. Fair enough. Don studied him for a long moment. "What I do know," he finally said, "is that around here people got long memories." The moment JDVance changed the conversation. They remembered every promise made to them, every time someone shook their hand, looked them in the eye and said they'd do something, only to walk away and never come back. JD tapped a knuckle against the table thinking. Then he said, "I don't blame them for that." Don huffed out a laugh, shaking his head. "That's the problem. Nobody ever does." A beat passed. Then, from the counter, the old man in the work jacket spoke again. "I worked 35 years in a factory. 35 damn years." He set his coffee down with a soft thunk. "I watched my neighbors lose their jobs, watched whole families pack up and leave because there wasn't anything left for them. Watched politicians show up, shake a few hands, tell us they understood, then drive back to wherever the hell they came from." JD met his eyes. "And do you think I'm one of those politicians?" The old man stared at him for a long time. Then he shrugged. "I don't know." But then he pointed a calloused finger at JD. "You're the only one who stuck around to listen." That landed. The waitress behind the counter shifted, glancing toward Don. The two cooks in the kitchen exchanged looks. Even the younger guy in the booth, who had been the loudest critic, suddenly had nothing to say. JD let the silence settle. Then he turned back to Don. "So, what's it gonna be?" Don tapped his fingers on the table, looked toward the kitchen, exhaled again. Then he stood. "Mary," he called toward the counter, "get him a menu." A ripple of surprise passed through the diner. The younger guy let out a scoff. But he didn't argue. Mary hesitated for only a second before reaching for a laminated menu and walking it over. JD took it with a small nod of thanks. "Appreciate it." Don shook his head, half in amusement, half in disbelief. "I still don't know if I like you." JD smiled, flipping open the menu. "That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me." Don let out a short chuckle, then turned toward the kitchen. "All right, boys, fire up the grill." And just like that, what started as a refusal turned into something no one in that diner would forget. The tension had faded. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the clinking of forks against plates to return. Enough for the low murmur of conversation to slowly rebuild itself. JD sat at the booth, menu in hand, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching Don. Watching the old man at the counter. Watching the younger guy in the booth who still looked skeptical, but wasn't smirking anymore. Mary, the waitress, poured him a cup of coffee without a word. He nodded in thanks. She hesitated for half a second, then muttered, "We make it strong here." JD took a sip and raised an eyebrow. "I can tell." A few people chuckled. It wasn't much, but it was something. Don was still standing by the kitchen, arms crossed, watching JD, like he was trying to figure out what to make of him. Finally, he sighed and walked back over. "All right," he said, dropping into the seat across from him again. "Since you're here, tell me something." JD set the menu down. "What's that?" Don tilted his head slightly. "You ever had this happen before?" JD thought about that. Not just the rejection, because rejection was part of the job. People loved you one minute, hated you the next. But this? Being told he wasn't welcome in a place as simple as a diner? The moment JDVance chose to stay not like this. Not with this kind of weight behind it. "No," JD admitted, "not like this." Don nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd been wondering. "And you stayed." JD leaned back slightly, took another sip of coffee. "Yeah," Don let out a small chuckle. "Most guys in your position would have walked out, made a fuss, maybe called a lawyer, maybe made sure this place was plastered all over the news by morning." JD smirked. "Thought about it." Don laughed at that, shaking his head. Then he sobered. "You're not going to change everyone's mind." JD nodded. "I know," Don exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "And I can't promise I won't regret serving you tomorrow morning." JD grinned. That's fair. From the counter, the old man with the work jacket muttered, still not looking up from his coffee. Still a damn shame when a man can't get a burger. JD turned toward him. Well, I think that's about to change. A moment later, Mary appeared, setting a plate down in front of him, a classic diner cheeseburger, hand-cut fries on the side. Simple. Perfect. JD picked it up, took a bite. Silence, then, with a straight face, little dry. For half a second, the diner was dead still. Then Don barked out a laugh, a real, genuine laugh. A few others chuckled. Mary just shook her head. JD set the burger down, wiping his hands on a napkin. Kidding? It's good. Don smirked, shaking his head. You're a piece of work. JD nodded. I've been told. The younger guy in the booth didn't say anything, but his expression had shifted. He wasn't sold. Not completely, but he wasn't dismissing JD outright anymore either. And as JD finished his meal, the diner started to feel like a diner again. Conversations picked up. Plates clattered. Coffee refills were poured. People still had their opinions. Still had their doubts. But for one night in one small town, a different kind of conversation happened. And maybe that was enough. Because in a time when everyone is ready to shout, sometimes the real power is in staying. Listening and proving, if only for a moment, that not everything has to be a fight. If you made it this far, I've got one question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between walking away and staying to listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think, and if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.